So this is an opportunity for me to present some new work with my co-author George Evans on a project we've been involved in for some time now, which studies the stability under adaptive learning of sunspot equilibria. I presented papers on sunspot equilibria for quite a while now, but never with so many experts on sunspots in the audience. So I feel kind of funny reminding you what a sunspot equilibrium is, but I think I will anyway, so we're all on the same page. At least for me, a sunspot equilibrium is going to be a rational expectations equilibrium that depends also on some extrinsic noise process. The function of this noise process is precisely to coordinate the expectations of the agents. And so in this way, the sunspot equilibrium itself is self-fulfilling. And so I'll start with a brief motivation section and emphasize, when I turn the microphone goes away, and emphasize this particular point that the sunspot equilibria is self-fulfilling. And I wanted to try to convince audiences, maybe this audience needs less convincing, that these kinds of equilibria, while they may seem exotic, actually are taken seriously by a variety of important economists, and I chose a French economist for today's talk. And so you can read the quote yourself, but anyway, I take these self-fulfilling prophecies important, and I think equilibrium multiplicity needs to be studied. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a very short review of the relevance of sunspot equilibria for macroeconomics, and in particular emphasize the reason why George and I think studying stability under learning is important, and then that'll provide a platform for the new results we're going to discuss today. Okay, so it's natural to wonder whether these strange creatures even are consistent with notions of rationality. They were shown, at least in the modern context, to be consistent by a variety of authors in the late 70s and early 80s, for example, Azariadis and Schell. And they studied these sunspot equilibria in stylized overlapping generations models. And it'll be important for us today that the sunspot processes they studied were finite state Markov processes. And that's largely how it remained, with a notable exception. Mike Woodward has a paper in a quite a general context on continuous sunspot equilibria with continuous support around the same time, mid-80s. The sunspot equilibria became of more practical importance or of interest to applied economists in the 90s when a variety of authors, including Jess Menabib and Roger Farmer, and their co-authors discovered that DSG models, particular RBC-type models, modified to incorporate some sort of non-convexity, were consistent with indeterminacy. When I say indeterminacy, of course, I mean the presence of sunspot equilibria. And what's more, these authors found that they could take these models, calibrate them to the data, tune the sunspots in such a way as to reproduce code movements from their models consistent with the US data, at least in a variety of dimensions. And so in this way, sunspot equilibria became a theory of the business cycle. And then with the rise of the new Keynesian models of the dominant paradigm, they became of even policy importance. You see, it was found, I'm sure many of you know this, that new Keynesian models exhibited indeterminacy or were prone to it if monetary policy was specified in particular ways. And also, these sunspot equilibria were, at least in general, thought to be bad because they seemed to generate excess volatility, and this was welfare reducing. So there is policy relevance for these creatures. Now, it's natural to wonder with these exotic creatures whether just the mere existence, maybe that doesn't mean they're of practical importance. After all, when you have a model with sunspot equilibria, there's also sitting there the fundamental equilibrium. Why don't the agents just coordinate on it? Mike Woodward gave us an answer to this in his 1990 paper. He used stability under adaptive learning as an equilibrium selection mechanism, and he found, very interesting result, that if agents thought the sunspots might be relevant, then they would learn that they were relevant over time. And so in this way, agents could learn to coordinate their expectations on the sunspot equilibrium. So that was a nice result. That was also done in the overlapping generations model context, and the sunspot equilibria there were finite state Markov sunspots. George Evans and Seppo Hakapoina generalized that result in the sense that they studied models of a general form, univariate models, and those models also had finite state Markov structure. But then George and Seppo came along and somewhat, well, threw the literature a curveball in the following sense. You see, this result by Mike Woodford, this provides some credence to the idea that the sunspot equilibria are important. But then George and Seppo found that the equilibria studied by, well, in particular in this case, Farmer and Gough, these sunspots with, incidentally, I forgot to mention, continuous support, they were not stable under learning. And then a variety of authors studied a variety of RBC-type models and found that just in general, the sunspot equilibria in these models were not stable under learning. So this leads to an interesting puzzle, which is where I'm headed today. Why were the sunspots in Mike's model stable under learning and the sunspots in Roger's model unstable under learning? Well, George and I examined this question, and to do this, we developed what we call the theory of representations. And that's going to play a role today, so I need to briefly touch on it. I want you to think of a representation as the functional form of the forecasting models agents use when they form their expectations. This is important in learning because you need to specify a forecasting model so they can estimate it. Now, it turns out that a sunspot equilibrium may have multiple forecasting models consistent with it, and stability under learning may depend upon which forecasting model agents use. In essence, what we discovered was the agents in Mike's model were using one kind of forecasting model, and the agents in Farmer's model were using another kind of forecasting model. So what we did was we generalized the forecasting model that Mike's agents were using to incorporate sunspots with continuous support, and we found some interesting results. We found models where sunspots were thought never to be stable. They actually did have, there actually were stable sunspots in some of these models if agents used the appropriate representation, forecasting model. It didn't resolve the puzzle from the RBC literature. Those sunspots still seem to be unstable under learning, though there are some nice caveats to that I won't touch on. However, the sunspot equilibria in the new Keynesian models did turn out to be stable under learning given the appropriate representation. So that sort of brings us to where my talk is going to launch. You see, George and I are now interested in thinking about what happens in the nonlinear environment. All the stability results I spoke about, which were related to sunspots with continuous support, have been conducted, the studies have been done, the results proven in linearized models, but of course the models themselves are fundamentally nonlinear, so it's natural to wonder what happens in the nonlinear environment. That's the kind of question I want to ask today, and it brings up a lot of interesting issues. The first question is, what do the sunspots look like? The sunspot equilibria in linear models, they're easy to write down to characterize, pretty easy. At least they're easy relative to the sunspots in nonlinear models. So we need to think about what these sunspot equilibria actually look like. That's important because remember, I need to give my agents a forecasting model to estimate if I'm going to study stability. I have to know what the sunspots look like if I'm going to give them a forecasting model. Once I give them a forecasting model, then I can study stability analysis, try to find out whether agents could learn to coordinate on these sunspots. And here, then, I'm going to employ the kinds of theories that George Evans spoke about earlier this morning. And then finally, I think this is the most important question to address. I was actually at a conference. Where's Mordecai? Usually he's somewhere. There he is. I was at a conference in front of Mordecai, and someone from the audience, as I was presenting a stability result in a linearized model, someone from the audience asked me, what does it say about stability of the sunspot in the nonlinear model? And I didn't know. And I wondered, and he wondered, a very good question, is there any relation at all? You would think there might be, but a priori it's not obvious. So we're going to try to assess whether stability in the linearized model, which we know how to study, has any information about stability in the nonlinear model. So that's what we're going to do today. I wish there was a clock right there. Okay, I want to do this in a general context. But I wanted to provide an anchor for intuition. Some people really like to have a model to hang their hats on, and I'm among them. So here's my very simple laboratory. This is, of course, this model is not due to me. Standard, simple, two-period overlapping generations model. The young work and the old consume. It's going to be a yeoman farmer model, so the young own their production technology and it's linear, so it's completely trivial. Markets are competitive. The only problem here is that the good is perishable, so the agents have to provide some sort of storage mechanism, and money is going to serve that purpose. Okay. Here's the formalities of the model. I'm just going to write down the rational expectations model. It's true that I'm going to study stability under learning in a little while. Normally, when I'm going to study stability under learning from a micro-founded model, I want to embed the learning mechanisms at the micro level and then aggregate. I'm going to do the opposite here to save time. However, in the paper that doesn't exist, we do it the other way. And in general, I would do it the other way. If I had time, I would do it the other way. So here's the simple rational model. It's a homework assignment for first-year students. They're going to maximize their utility. They have positive utility from consumption, negative utility from working. They're a little bit lazy. And the only, maybe slightly non-standard thing here is to assume that we're going to price things in terms of goods instead of money. So QT is the goods price of money. And then I can write down this, the first order condition. It just equates marginal loss to expected marginal benefit. And so here expectations are, it's a nonlinear model. So here I'm looking at expectations of the product, but in general, it's the expectations of the return that are critical here. And then if I impose in equilibrium that there's a unit of money, I get this simple reduction of my model. And so this equation, I have a pointer. That's kind of exciting. This equation here is why I like this so much. It's nonlinear, but it only has one parameter. And the two steady states are staring at me. Qt equals 0, that's autarky. Qt equals 1, that's the monetary steady state. And the only parameter I'm worried about here is the is sigma. And what this does tell me, by the way, and this is important, is where this expectation operator goes. It goes on the outside of the nonlinear function. Okay, so this is the little baby model you want to have in mind. It tells us that in general, this is the model we want to study. I'm going to develop the theory today in the simplest possible context, but the idea is to also develop the theory in more general models. So here's the simplest possible nonlinear forward-looking macro model, which I've recentered at 0. And what I want to do then is study multiple equilibria in this model. You can see one, yt equals 0. That's a rational expectations equilibrium. What do the other equilibria look like? Okay? Now, instead of answering that hard question, I'm going to answer an easy one to start with, one that I think we're all familiar with, and in fact, maybe this model, this precise model, has been put on the board before. I'm going to linearize the model I just showed you around the perfect foresight steady state. Beta here is simply the derivative of f at 0. Now here's a model that I love because I'm beginning to understand it, and we can characterize all of its solutions. By the way, the only important feature of this model, I'm going to assume beta is larger than 1 in magnitude. That provides the indeterminate case. So as many of you know, this is when the sunspot equilibria exist. What do equilibria in this model look like? We already know there's the fundamentals solution, yt equals 0. There are many other solutions, and here's how I'm going to look at them. I'm going to write the sunspot equilibria as follows. Let CT, and by the way, that's how I pronounce that thing. And I've been in many debates, and I tend to lose them. I'm going to let CT be a martingale difference sequence. I want you to think of it as being IID. That's not necessary, but it'll help my little story. And then using this martingale difference sequence, I'm going to build a stochastic process A to T, and it has this autoregressive component beta inverse, which is going to play an important role. And then it's not difficult to show. In fact, you can just plug it in. This is an equilibrium to the model. Notice that because beta is larger than 1 in magnitude, beta inverse is smaller than 1 in magnitude, so A to T is asymptotically stationary. And moreover, if you give me any rational expectations equilibrium, I can find a CT, which builds A to T so that the rational expectations equilibrium looks like that. I guess I should have emphasized I'm looking for bounded solutions to my linearized model. So the one point I want to make here is this lag coefficient beta inverse. It's called the resonance frequency, and it is important. It is important that A to T have beta inverse as the lag coefficient. If that wasn't the lag coefficient, then it doesn't matter what martingale difference sequence you give me, that wouldn't be a sunspot. So we're going to call that the resonance frequency, and that makes the sunspot look somewhat restrictive. Okay, that's what these equilibria look like. How do you do stability under learning? Well, normally at this point I would have to launch into a discussion of stability under learning, but I can just say, see George's talk earlier. The idea is quite simple. I'm going to give my agents a forecasting model that's consistent with the equilibrium I just wrote down. In your mind, the story goes like this. They estimate the forecasting model, they make decisions based on the estimates, they act, and new data are generated, and the process repeats. I can analyze stability, though, using this E-stability principle that George emphasized this morning, and that makes my life much easier and the analysis much quicker. So here's how it goes. The perceived law of motion, the functional form of the forecasting model I provide my agents, is given right here as this PLM. I am assuming that the agents do not know the model has a zero steady state. I'm going to force them to learn that. That's important. Notice the agent's beliefs are completely captured by this pair of parameters A and B. Now, how does E-stability work? I compute the actual law of motion, the law of motion that results from agents making forecasts based on this perceived law of motion, and then plugging it back into my linear model. This is the data generating process implied by the beliefs. And then we can form the T-map, which you saw this morning. Still not sure I figured out why it's called a T-map. Notice that a fixed point of the T-map is a rational expectations equilibrium, simple intuition. That's when perceptions coincide with the truth. We want to know when this fixed point, and notice there are many of them here, right? B goes to B, so if you set A equals 0, you get a continuum. This is the standard result in a linearized model. We want to know when these fixed points are stable under learning. What the E-stability principle tells us to do is study the following differential equation. We just see when it's stable. And that's easy to assess. That's the nice thing about the E-stability principle. All I have to do is compute the derivative of t, see when the real parts of the eigenvalues are less than 1. You're kidding me. I've gone for 10 minutes? Yeah. I know, I'm just teasing. He didn't get it, but shift into a higher gear. No, it's good. This is a... okay, I'm sure it'll work out. Anyway, so we say that, notice that a fixed point of the T-map, a rational expectations equilibrium, is also a rest point of this differential equation. If that fixed point is Lyapunov stable, then we say the equilibrium is stable under learning, and that's easily assessed by computing these eigenvalues. And here they are, and importantly, I want you to ignore one. We don't have time for you to ask me questions about it. I need the real parts of these eigenvalues, they're staring at you right here, to be less than 1 in magnitude, so beta needs to be less than -1 for these sunspots to be stable under learning, standard result, negative feedback. Okay, here's the OLG analog, sigma needs to be bigger than 2. Okay, let's turn to the nonlinear model. Forget about the questions because I already asked them, except this one. These two questions I already asked. This one's important. This resonance frequency, this beta inverse, this lag coefficient, it seems restrictive. I want to know if it's really generic, if that restriction is generic. Here's how we're going to study it. Here's the general model. I'm going to use my linearized model and what I've learned there as a platform to study this one. It gives me a little peek. I need to assume F is appropriately smooth. You can ask me how smooth it is, but I don't have time to answer. Remember, it goes through 0. And the only thing I'm going to require is that we're in the indeterminate case. So now I have 3 goals. 1, what do the sunspots look like? 2, are they stable under learning? And 3, what about this resonance frequency deal? I don't know what they look like, and so I'm not going to answer that question. Instead, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to embrace bounded rationality of my agents, and I'm going to assume they have linear perceptions. I'm going to assume my agents have a linear forecasting model, but they're going to use them to form forecasts in this nonlinear environment. So this will generate a restricted perceptions equilibrium, which George talked about this morning. And I'm going to do it also by allowing the resonance frequency of my sunspot, eta t, to be perturbed by a perturbation parameter mu. So that's the only distinction in the agent's beliefs. Notice my agent's beliefs are still captured by the pair A and B. Given this perceived law of motion, I can quite easily write down the data generating process. Here it is. Notice that they're forming forecasts of yt plus 1 based on their linearized forecasting model, on their linear forecasting model, but they're forming expectations of a nonlinear function. Importantly, if they have beliefs 0, 0, then out pops 0. I'm sure you can see where this is going. The only thing left for me to do is place some restriction on the belief parameters A and B. I want to give my agent some discipline. I want them to be as good as possible within the world I'm looking, and so I'm going to just simply project my data generating process onto the span of a constant and my sunspot and look for a T-map. In this sense, my agents will have the best possible linear forecasting model in their nonlinear world. And this projection is also very simple to compute, and here's a sort of a general formulation of the projection. You can very easily see that the perfect foresight steady state is a fixed point, so this map reproduces, this notion of equilibrium reproduces the perfect foresight steady state. I'm going to call a non-trivial fixed point a near-rational sunspot equilibrium. It's an equilibrium because beliefs affect the data generating process, and the data generating process determines if the beliefs are optimal. It's self-fulfilling because if people think it's 0, it is 0. And it's near-rational because it's optimal within the class of beliefs they allow themselves. The only concern I have now is whether this thing exists. I always get nervous about this point, and then I can relax. Yeah, they exist. And so there's a theorem whose proof, obviously, I'm not going to have time to go through. It turns out what I like about this result is they exist exactly when the model is indeterminate, exactly when sunspots, the normal sunspots, exist. So I don't have to learn any new tools to assess whether sunspot equilibria exist in this model, at least these near-rational sunspot equilibria. I was going to talk about the proof. I'm just going to flip to, oops, not that way. I'm going to flip through a picture instead. The proof is done using bifurcation analysis, and there's a variety of different types of bifurcations that can occur. One of them is a pitchfork, and that's the only thing that's important for me from this picture. I apologize for the speed at this point. Notice a near-rational sunspot equilibrium is going to correspond to a graph like this crossing the horizontal axis, and if the slope is negative, it's going to be stable as a fixed point of a differential equation. That's going to be important for me. This is simply existence of these near-rational sunspot equilibria. But if I want to study stability under learning, all I do is I study the stability of this. Let me scoot ahead to my differential equation. All I do is study stability, the E-stability of the fixed points. Stability of the fixed points. I study E-stability. So all I have to do is study this differential equation. This is the differential equation that gave that bifurcation. And so what we learn is this. We learn as the bifurcation parameter. Remember what the bifurcation parameter was? I should bring that back. The bifurcation parameter was the perturbation of the resonance frequency. As I move the perturbation parameter across the resonance frequency, the steady state, the perfect foresight steady state destabilizes. New steady states emerge, and the new steady states inherit the stability of the original steady state. And so these new steady states then are stable fixed points of this differential equation, which means they're E-stable, which means they're stable under learning. And so in essence, we get the following result, and result number 2. You do need beta to be less than 1, just like in the linear model, and in that case, you have these near-rational sunspot equilibria, and they're stable under learning. So how much time do I have, Roger? 2 minutes?
3 minutes.
Yes. So this is my 3-minute page. Okay, why do I like these results?
Let's say 3 minutes 37.
3, oh, okay. Okay, I'll sit for a second. No.
I'm joking.
Okay, the sunspot equilibria exists. We proved that. That was our first result. What I really like about this is they exist, as I said, whenever the linearized model, whenever they exist in the linearized model, whenever the steady state is indeterminate. And furthermore, all you have to do is know whether the sunspot equilibria in the linearized model are stable. It's the same condition, right? Beta less than -1. So this answers that question that the guy in the back of the room when Mordecai was there asked me. How is E-stability related? E-stability in the linearized model, at least in this case, implies E-stability of these near-rational sunspot equilibria in the nonlinear model. So it's a strong result. And this brings up something that I've started to emphasize enough to make it kind of pink. I call it the MSV principle. This is the idea. George and I have been studying these for a while, and we've discovered a common trend. The MSV solution, the minimal state variable solution, often exists even when there's sunspots. Not always, but often. If it exists, and it's stable under learning, which is easy to assess, then stable sunspots exist. That's not a theorem, but every time we study models, we see that seems to be true. Well, what this result here shows is that it even seems to work in the nonlinear environment because the MSV solution is stable under learning when beta is less than -1. So it just seems like if you find out you have sunspots and your MSV solution is stable under learning, watch out, or I don't know whether you're going to be excited or disappointed, but either way, I bet sunspots exist. And then finally, I'll quit with this last point. This knife edge resonance frequency requirement, it was an artifact of the linearization. For any perturbation off the resonance frequency, these near-rational sunspot equilibria exist. The resonance frequency was a bifurcation parameter, and so it's not as restrictive as it looks. Okay, thanks for your patience with my acceleration.